This very important video essay begins in the 18th century, as it should, with Frenchman and physician Philip Pinel.
Closer and closer, our cameramen work their way.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Rated M.
Nice to make your acquaintance, audience. I'm Mads. I'm 27. That makes me an elder Gen Zer. Yes, I expect you to bow. We're bringing back old-fashioned values. Get down on your knees. I grew up Mormon in the suburbs of Utah, which means nobody drank alcohol, coffee was evil, crap was a swear word, R-rated movies didn't exist, PG-13 movies were all cut to remove the sex scenes. But I'll tell you what about the Mormon neighborhoods I grew up in. There was no such thing as helicopter parents. Kids were raised free range. I love the Mormons. I think they do a great job raising children. Believe it or not. I grew up in the last beautiful, blissful time on Earth where children did not have cell phones and iPads. Every day, me and my friends would call each other on the landline to meet up at one of each other's basements to play Mario Kart and tennis on the Wii, Mario Dance Dance Party on the pad, and Guitar Hero. And after we got bored of our video games, we'd raid the fridge. And after we raided the fridge, we were unleashed on the outside. And we'd go run to the park to do whatever the hell we wanted. The only rules were be home by dark or call. I share this for the benefit of the younger generation to understand that you can enjoy screens for a little bit and have a lot more fun outside after you're done. Go outside. Anyways, I was a good kid, and I love my friends.
No, that's not nice, Madison. Madison! Madison, I hate to send you to your room on your birthday. Don't do that to Emily. That's not nice.
Every kid has little issues, but my parents said that they thought I was a piece of cake to raise.
Oh, there's Barbie from behind.
My parents raised me right.
What kind of party is it?
A Scooby-Doo party.
He's your favorite guy?
Yeah.
Why do you like him so much?
Because he solves mysteries.
He's a mystery solver, huh?
And he's a scaredy cat.
And a scaredy cat.
When I was around 7 years old, a robbery came on the news where the guy had killed someone in the house. And I remember watching as all the adults watched and reacted with shock and horror, saying things like, how could anybody do something like that? How awful. And it puzzled me. Not the robbery, their reactions. Not too long after, I was sitting alone at recess, kind of mulling it over, thinking about how they had reacted to the robbery and the killing. And I also thought about things I had heard of, like serial killers, like Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy. And people always ask the same questions. How could someone get like that? How could someone do something like that? And I didn't understand the question. What I really didn't get is why people thought there had to be some complex motivation. I thought it was as simple as they had a reason to do it or they just wanted to do it. Whether it was out of convenience, curiosity, or just a whim of some kind. I didn't think there needed to be an explanation for that. While I was sitting there, I had an epiphany. Caring about other people, to me, was something that I was opting into. And I cared about people, genuinely. I love my friends, and I love seeing them happy. Not because it benefited me in some roundabout way. I just liked them, so I was happy to see them happy. But I didn't question for a second that I could just stop caring about other people and do whatever the fuck I wanted. I sat there and I thought, well, I care about my friends. Could I kill them? And the answer was pretty immediate and obvious. Yeah. I love my friends, but if I wanted to, I could kill them. And I don't think I'd feel bad about it. That was part of the epiphany I had, was that was really obvious to me, but other people didn't seem to feel that way. And I almost couldn't believe it. Are these adults lying? Do they really not get it? Why someone would do that? Is it really a mystery to them? But that's the way I saw it, is that I was opting into caring about other people. And it seemed like, man, I don't know if everyone is like consciously choosing to care. It might be something kind of specific to me, that I'm choosing it rather than it being automatic. The second part of the epiphany I had was when I started to get really excited. I realized that just like that man was robbing houses and killing people, I too one day could do that. And it sounded really fun to me. Now, in retrospect, I have to assume this man's motivations were probably that he didn't expect someone to be in the house and killed them by happenstance, not because he thought it was fun. In all likelihood. But that's how I perceived it as a child. You know, when you're a kid, teachers always ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And every time I was asked that question, I gave a different answer, and I meant all of them. I said, I want to be a paleontologist. I want to be a chemist. I want to be a physicist. I want to be a singer. I want to be an actor. I want to be Hannah Montana. I want to be an artist. I want to be a person that works at the zoo. I want to be a firefighter, a hero. I really wanted to be all these things. But that day, I added 2 things to my list. I wanted to be a serial killer and a bank robber. Now, I was a pretty smart little tot, and I knew I could not inform the teachers of my plans. The only con little me saw was, of course, once you opt out of society and start robbing, but especially killing, you are going to get kicked out of society and spend the rest of your life in prison, which didn't sound so bad to little me. But there were a lot of things in broader society that I wanted to do. Like I said, I had a long list. And I knew I had to participate in society and not do the things that would get me kicked out to be able to do all the things I wanted in life. And it wasn't a problem for me. I enjoyed participating. I was happy-go-lucky. But I still wanted to go all in on doing whatever the fuck I wanted at some point. But that's a card, if you think like me, like I did as a kid, you can really only play once. So I took a fuck it card, a fictional one, and slipped it in my back pocket and decided that I would participate in society and do everything I possibly wanted to do first. And then one day when I was done, I'd pull the fuck it card out and play it. And then I'd do whatever the fuck I wanted till I got caught and either spend the rest of my life in prison or get killed myself. The moral faculties were basically thought to govern 3 things. 1, a person's emotions or their affective states. 2, a person's moral sentiments or their sense of right and wrong. And 3, a person's volition and inhibition, or willpower. In school, teachers always had us write little paragraphs to prompts in the morning. One of the prompts, I assume, was what makes you angry. I wrote, something that makes me angry is when someone tells me what I am doing wrong when they are doing it wrong. It disgusts me so much I would kill myself. I am tired of when people do that like Larissa did that day. And I was a good friend. And I enjoyed friends because I had a lot of fun with my friends until around the age of 13 when I stopped relating to anybody. I made all my friends sign a contract before I agreed to go with them to my family's cabin for the weekend. To my lovely friends, the contract. The trip you are about to embark on is a glorious journey of homework, movies, and junk food. Feel free to laugh and act like the idiots you are. The cabin is an ugly little shed in the middle of a desert at the base of an ugly little mountain. You ugly little people get to spend 2 nights at said ugly little shed. We should have an ugly little time, if and only if you understand the nature of our trip. A list of demands followed. Sign official contract below. Warning! I know a ditch to bury all of you, so be good. This was not normal behavior for 13-year-old Mormon girls. When I was 14, I figured I don't really think about this religion stuff. So I ordered a book to the house called The Prophet Puzzle. The book was a collection of essays, half from people in the church and half from normal historians. And about halfway through, I decided I definitely didn't believe in the religion. I also came to the conclusion, there might not be a God. And those two thoughts filled me with excitement because of all the possibilities of what the universe was and meant that I didn't know about. And so I sat for a second and was like, wow, I don't know anything about reality. Isn't that so cool? And then without skipping a beat, my next thought was, I'm going to try every single drug that exists on this planet. Contrary to what the DARE program I sat through every year in grade school promised me, when I got to high school, nobody was offering me drugs. I waited patiently for an opportunity to say yes to drugs, and it probably took a year and a half before I finally found someone I could buy weed from. I did as many drugs as I could get my hands on, but it wasn't many. Mostly psychedelics, Adderall, and my dog's hydrocodone prescription. I'll never forget how pissed I was at 19 when I left a house party early because it got boring. And immediately after, a friend of a friend showed up and brought cocaine. I was so angry. The friend that told me about it acted like it was a problem that someone had shown up with cocaine. The only problem was that I was not there to say yes to cocaine. You have no idea how long I had waited to try coke. I was a straight A student in high school, despite having the second worst attendance record at both high schools I attended. I even took summer classes because I enjoyed learning and graduated with my college degree. I actually didn't do shit senior year because I only had 2 more classes I had to take to graduate. I was late to my first class of the day almost every single day of the year, skipped as much class as possible, and did as little work as possible. And I was very proud of pulling that off. Another friend confided to me that she used to be a shoplifter and had gotten arrested after trying to drag a cabinet out of a Hobby Lobby and relayed it with shame about how sorry she was for how it made her family feel. And my thought to that was, I legitimately had never thought about shoplifting and was going to start doing that now. Thank you. Also took money out of people's purses, stuff out of a couple garages, and robbed a couple houses, but all that's neither here nor there in the grand scheme. Another point in high school, a different friend confided in me that they had gotten off to a rape video and they felt really, really, really bad about it. And I remember that not computing at all. I had no idea how you could possibly feel bad about that, especially since you hadn't done anything. As charming as my writings were as a little kid, it was not nearly as charming as my writing as a 20-year-old in a Google Doc to myself after I was not able to find a drug dealer. I wrote, "My only vices are raping and murdering." A little joke between me and me. Pannell, had studied medicine, but due to some highly relatable early life failures, he did not go on to become a traditional physician, and he instead worked for most of his career as a writer and editor for various medical journals and magazines. I went to college with aspirations of getting a STEM degree in some kind of science. I couldn't pick which, and minoring in chemistry so that I could take classes through organic chemistry to learn how to manufacture my own LSD and to set up a business on the dark web selling LSD. I had never had the opportunity to try LSD, but I wanted to make it because I wanted to try it and because it was an easy drug to get through customs. But my Agora business never came to pass because I dropped out in the middle of the first semester of college for no fucking reason. And I blew off a scholarship doing that. And although I wasn't attending my classes per norm, I wasn't failing. After I dropped out of college and told people that I planned to have like $100,000 saved in the bank after 1 or 2 years, what I actually did is I worked a bunch of menial jobs and quit them 2 to 3 months in. One of them, I was working at a fast food place, and an enormous amount of shake orders came in at the same time. And I just had an epiphany mid-shift. I don't have to be here. So instead of making everyone shake, I made myself a shake. Strawberry cheesecake, the best one. And I left mid-shift without telling anybody that I was quitting. That was until a dear friend of his fell ill with what would later be called manic depressive disorder or bipolar disorder. Now, you may recognize that word if you've ever used it as a slur. Without going into minutia, bipolar type 1, psychosis with mood disturbances, schizoaffective disorder, psychosis, sometimes with mood disturbances, sometimes without, schizophrenia, psychosis, with no mood disturbances. In 1783, that friend ultimately committed suicide. Wee. It was the hopelessness of his friend's situation and Pinnell's own helplessness and inability to intervene that ultimately inspired him to devote himself to the study of insanity. In 1793, Pinnell became the leading physician at Bicêtre Hospital in the suburbs of Paris, and it was there that he began his most serious work at trying to study and treat the insane. You want to know my favorite thing about Pinnell? Apparently, he put on theatrical performances to help cure patients of their delusions. There was this one guy who had a delusion that they were going to guillotine him, and so he put on a mock trial and declared him innocent, so the guy could be sure he wasn't going to get his head cut off. Which, hasn't psychiatry always been a mix of art and science? Pinnell is often pitched as an advocate for the humanitarian treatment of the mentally ill, which isn't wrong, but also wasn't really what Pinnell was all about. There's 2 main reasons for this, and they're the 2 things Pinnell is most famous for. One is the myth that Pinnell removed the chains from the mentally ill at Bicêtre while he was working as the lead physician there. He didn't. Although he did support his friend named Puss in Boots did remove the chains from the mentally ill at Bicêtre, and he replaced them with comfortable and stylish straitjackets. The second thing that Pinnell's known for is his principles of traitement moral, which was translated into English as moral treatment. Due to the word moral, the moral treatment of the mentally ill, as proposed by Pinnell, is often taken to mean the compassionate treatment of the mentally ill, banning barbaric practices like chains. But the French word le moral actually referred to one's mental or emotional state as opposed to morality. So when Pinnell used the term traitement moral, he was actually referring to the psychological treatment of the mentally ill. Although you could argue that trying to psychologically treat the insane is more humane than the tried and true method of simply beating the demons out of them with sticks. Part of the confusion with the translation and the term moral treatment is that there was actually a group of Americans who were engaging in moral treatment and did mean it in the moral sense. A pack of Quakers called the Tuke family used the term moral treatment to refer to treating the mentally ill with kindness and instilling Quaker values. So, what were Pinnell's principles of traitement moral? We can derive them from the three groups that Pinnell shitted upon. The first group of people that Pinnell put on blast were the physicians and staffs at asylums who used excessive and unnecessarily cruel punishments. Not just because it was morally wrong to be cruel, but because the patients got worse when you treated them cruelly. They regressed. Ineffective strategy. The second group of people that Pinnell put on blast were English physicians who publicized high cure rates for their patients, but did not publish their methodology and did not report their failures.
Dr. Willis cures 9 lunatics out of 10. I cannot help congratulating those gentlemen who feel no difficulties in the treatment of any disease to which the human frame is subject, and who are ever ready to entertain us with the relation of their incomparable success.
Pinnell wanted to see the field move forward, and he believed in doing that, publicizing failures was as important as publicizing successes. To make that point and set the example, in his book, Pinnell describes some cases where he personally treated someone and the treatment failed, one of which the patient committed suicide. And the third group that Pinnell shits on are the armchair nosologists, who come up with all sorts of categories and terms for mental disorders without any real personal firsthand experience treating patients. I'm of the opinion that we should get rid of the term prosocial psychopath. Too many people want to be it. Plus, I hate the term. We should set it on fire. In my opinion, psychopathy should be reserved for people who have a real disorder. It's not supposed to be a special personality that people want to have and will lie on questionnaires to say they have this special personality. Psychopathy might be partly based in someone's innate temperament, but I don't think it's just that. I think we're working with abnormalities and disorders by the time you get diagnosed with psychopathy. I think it's the fearlessness hypothesis fault. I think everyone wants to be fearless. I blame it's Licken's fault. It's all Licken's fault. Everyone wants to think they're fearless, and because they think psychopaths are fearless, which they're not. Everyone wants to be a psychopath because they want to be cool under pressure and charming and fearless. But that's not really what psychopathy is about. In contrast to the first of the noble Quaker quackers and many others, Pinnell believed that merely taking a kind but firm approach to dealing with the mentally ill was not enough. Pinnell believed that successful treatment of any mental illness depended on a clear and extensive view of its causes, symptoms, and varieties. That is, physicians should aim for a deep understanding of each mental illness and its root causes. For achieving that deep level of understanding, he recommended that physicians engage in the careful study of luminous histories of the disease and candid reports of the indication and application of remedies, whether successful or otherwise, with the end goal of one day placing this branch of the healing arts upon a level with its kindred pursuits. Kindred pursuits being the other branches of medicine. And this was Pinnell's true advocacy: to treat the study of mental disease as seriously as the study of physical disease. After shitting on nosologists, Pinnell and I decided to give it a try. Pinnell's problem with the nosologists was not in what they were doing in trying to break down mental disorders into groupings. His problem with them was doing so without firsthand experience of the disorders that they were naming. pontificating about things they didn't actually know anything about. To the contrary, Pinnell believed that accurately being able to group mental illnesses, hopefully into categories that had a similar or the same root cause, was the critical task of psychiatry. Because hopefully you'd like to identify the root cause, because knowing the root cause of a disorder is going to inform how you treat it. Isn't the best form of treatment going to come from an understanding of the mechanism that's gone awry? And even if you can't accurately get down to what the exact root cause is, your hope is that your grouping of patients share the same root cause anyway, or a similar enough one that if you apply treatments to that group, it'll work well for all of the patients involved. If they don't, you might need to redefine your group. Perhaps the patients in your group may superficially look similar on the surface, but have vastly different things going on under the hood, and you need to find a way to differentiate between them. Boards of clinicians have agreed on these categories, right? Bipolar, schizophrenia, and schizoaffective disorder. And it makes a lot of sense that if you were just working with a list of symptoms that you see from patients, that these disorders that involve psychosis might be split up by mood. Because just as psychotic symptoms are pretty stand out when you're interacting with the person, so are mood symptoms, and especially mania. But the issue is, over the last 40 years, using these categories, researchers have not made much progress in improving the treatment for each of the patients in the categories. And second to that, based on the laboratory and neuropsych tests that they have run, they found that each of these groups are really heterogeneous. And that is, the people in them perform very differently on a bunch of different laboratory measures. So it's really unclear if these groups actually are mapping to a biological reality. So basically, the idea is, the people diagnosed with bipolar may not actually have the same disease because the laboratory measures between different people diagnosed with bipolar vary so widely. Same for schizophrenia, same for schizoaffective disorder. But basically, BSNP came in to save the day. So what happened is they took 1,900 people who were diagnosed with bipolar, schizoaffective, and schizophrenia, and they performed a whole bunch of laboratory tasks and measures on them. Some MRI-based, some performance-based, some EEG measures. So they collected all this data, right? And then they used statistical methods to sort people into groups. So instead of the disorders already mentioned, we have a type 1 and a type 2 and a type 3 of people who experience psychosis. The idea being that now that we've created groups based on biological data that are more homogeneous, these groups might actually map to the same or similar root cause or dysfunction. And if they map to the same or similar root cause or dysfunction, we might actually be able to now study these groups and come up with treatments that actually work for the people in the groups we've created. But what you'll notice about each of these groups is that they don't correspond to the original groups at all. Whether or not the patient experiences mood symptoms doesn't determine which group they go into. Of the groups of insanity that Pinnell set out, one stands out as being particularly interesting.
Madness without delirium.
Madness without any lesion of the understanding. Delirium, by the way, is essentially referring to psychosis or psychotic symptoms like delusions, hallucinations, perceptual distortions. Anything that causes an issue with understanding reality. Paul wrote that he originally believed that there was no such thing as madness without some form of delirium. But his experiences at Bicêtre proved him wrong. Pinnell lists 3 examples of patients who all seem perfectly lucid, aware of themselves, no detectable delusions, and no intellectual deficits. And yet, they're all prone in some shape, way, or fashion to sanguinary fury. One of the patients listed is a quarrelsome fella who Pinnell speculates was not raised right.
Every instance of opposition or resistance roused him to acts of fury. He assaulted his adversary with the audacity of a savage.
The idea behind the behavioral inhibition system is just that if two wolves are in a fight and one of them pisses itself, the other wolf is supposed to recognize that as a signal of submission and back down. The human parallel is that if two humans are in a fight and one of them shits themselves, I can't keep that together. The other one is supposed to take that as a submission cue and back down, but psychopaths don't. This video is a bitch out test for all of your bisses.
If a dog, a horse, or any other animal offended him, he instantly put it to death. But an act of notoriety put an end to his career of violence. Enraged at a woman who had used offensive language to him, he precipitated her into a well.
Slights, frustration, irritation. It's all enough for pretty extreme violence, which sounds an awful lot like a concept in Hare's psychopathy, which is low frustration tolerance matched with poor behavioral controls.
The psychopathy checklist revised. Possible scores on the scale range from 0 to 40.
The brains of psychopaths are built differently.
You can see a statistically significant difference between the groups, but there's some overlap, right? So there are individuals in the non-psychopathic group who have a lower measure on this particular brain measure than do certain psychopathic offenders.
And results has just been all over the place. There's no like consistent patterns that has been found.
Sections associated with behavior and emotion are actually smaller than those of the general population.
Early on, there was a lot of enthusiasm for this idea that psychopathic person had this deform or deficit or impairment in the amygdala. that evidence was all reviewed by my colleague Philip Deming, and the conclusion is that no, there's just no consistent evidence.
Here's the thing, though. There really are people in these studies who are showing significant deviations from the norm. That said, the group is very heterogeneous. There are really people who show decreases in gray matter or structural differences in the paralimbic region, but frequently they show those differences in different regions and sometimes in different directions than expected. I think what psychopathy needs is something equivalent to what BSNP did. A P-SNP, if you will. Take a lot of people diagnosed with psychopathy and run the whole battery of any task that's ever had a positive result ever for psychopathy, get their structural MRI data, and see if there's a way to sort them into different types. Just like with individuals who experience psychosis, mood ended up not being the way to categorize them, even though that was the most obvious symptom that clinicians could see. With psychopathy, the obvious way that people have tried to split it up by anxiety may distinguish between different types of people with this disorder, or may not be one of the core factors. There's long been the idea of secondary and primary psychopathy being split by anxiety, but ignore that. Just run all the tests and sort them blind. The whole goal of having this label to begin with is to be able to design treatments for people. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, if there are individuals that exist that show pretty interesting differences from the norm, what are they like? Well, I know of one person who, hearsay has it, shows reduced gray matter in most of the paralimbic region and all the regions traditionally associated with psychopathy, including the orbitofrontal cortex and the amygdala, and that they're at the bottom of that spectrum of data, as in they're the worst one. the least gray matter of a group of psychopaths. There's one person, and that person is Brian Dugan, otherwise known as my best friend and my prison boyfriend and my lover in another timeline. Officially, Brian is a 37 out of 40 on the PCLR. Unofficially, hearsay has it, he's a 50 out of 40 on the PCLR. At least in most situations, you respond a little bit less than the average person, fear-wise. But I personally have seen you anxious. The first time we met. Can you confirm or deny?
You know, I wasn't anxious.
Yeah.
I had a desire for you to be real. And I wanted to see if you were who you said you were. And I don't think I was anxious.
You did say my cheek twitches when I'm anxious.
Yes, when I'm nervous or when I'm anxious, when I do have some kind of mental pressure, yeah, I do get a twitch in my left eye. And I was twitching. So, yeah.
A little, yeah. You were not functioning. You weren't super visibly anxious, but your demeanor was definitely different in a couple ways from when you were more comfortable later.
Well, yeah, I was examining you. I was in a high pressure situation for me.
There are a few crimes that Brian didn't commit. And if I tried to list every single crime that Brian's committed, this video would be 12 hours long. At every opportunity, Brian committed crimes when the thought was exciting. Brian did work a lot of jobs as well throughout his life, but he was always on the brink of being fired because he didn't do a good job, mostly because he was high all the time at his job. He'd go and get high on his lunch break. He had many stints in jail and was constantly getting arrested for something. And when he was 22, he had a stint in prison for about 3 years before he was paroled. And Brian's thoughts when he got to prison were, man, this place isn't as scary as I thought. And that was despite Brian carrying a shank around his neck as when he went to the showers, just in case anyone wanted to jump him or, drop the soap him. But there were a lot of drugs, and Brian had a lot of fun, even though he didn't really want to be in prison. Brian thought being in prison was pretty cool, and being a criminal was pretty cool, and everything else sucked. So why not continue? He didn't think that way completely. There were times where he tried to do a job seriously, but they didn't last very long. Before Brian went to prison, he tried to join the Marines and was rejected. And after that, and his stay in prison, he just decided that he was going to be a career criminal. So when he was paroled from prison at age 26, things escalated. Brian was driving around high, looking for a place to burglarize. And he walked up to a house and knocked on the door to see if anyone was home. And a little girl answered. That girl was home alone, sick. Brian spoke with the little girl, and the girl closed the door, and Brian turned to walk away. And then in a split second, he turned around. And then he kicked down the door, grabbed the girl, drove her out to a prairie road, raped her, and killed her with a tire iron. When Brian was 27, he was at a stoplight and saw a beautiful woman in the car next to him. And he followed that woman and sideswiped her car off the road. He pulled her out of the car and raped her and drowned her in a quarry. About 10 months after that, Brian saw two little girls riding bikes together, and he attempted to get both of them into his car. One girl escaped, and the girl that wasn't able to escape, he drove to a remote location and raped her and drowned her in a creek. On Brian's way home, he was stopped by an officer for having expired tags. Brian was also driving on a suspended license, but after questioning, the officer was satisfied, gave him a warning, and let Brian go home. Brian knew that he had been ID'd close to the crime, but he decided that he was going to go to work tomorrow like normal anyway. And so he got up in the morning and bought a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken and went to his job's parking lot before his shift and ate the chicken in his car. And then police officers swarmed his vehicle and told him to get out with his hands up. And what they yelled at him was, "You are under arrest for driving under a suspended license." The real reason that Brian was being arrested was because the little girl who had escaped gave a description to the police of the man who had kidnapped her friend and of the car he was driving. That was 1985, and Brian's been in prison ever since. But it's not important what these patients would be diagnosed with today, if they would even fit in a diagnostic category that we currently have. The important point is just that Pinnell made the observation 200 years ago that there are people who, without any hallucination, delusion, or intellectual impairment, who commit acts of violence that are so illogical that society and Pinnell deem them not just as bad actors, but mad and worthy of being committed to an asylum instead of a prison. So how do you get sickos to check themselves into a facility? Eyeing your dad's AR-15? Snooping on Craigslist for vans without windows? Fucking hate that guy on the news?
Let's make history together.
Thinking of killing people? Get the credit without the work! Check yourself into Homicidal Behavioral Health Facility, featuring MDMA treatments, art therapy, nurses, too many of them, all under the age of 30, and for the special few, video game treatments. Come here. So I discovered Brian. So I discovered Brian in Kent Kill's book, The Psychopath Whisperer. My impression of that book was, and Kill's writing, was the same impression I had as a little 7-year-old kid watching everyone react to the news. Kill said stuff like, "It was gonna be a tough interview. He looked at me with those flat eyes. Ooh la la. I knew that he was trying, but he lacked the capacity. I concur. Brian does the best that he can with what he has." Brian didn't seem capable of appreciating the gravity of the crimes he committed, even after decades of working with psychopaths. Highlight, damn it. It was still extremely difficult for me to accept that fact. What are you talking about? These are theater lines. What do you mean? What do you mean by can't comprehend the gravity? And what do you mean by you can't comprehend the lack of comprehension of the gravity? I am befuddled. I am confused.
I am confusion.
Now I remember why I didn't forget this chapter about Brian. When Brian was asked why he killed those girls, his mind just went blank. How the rest of us might feel if we were asked to solve Albert Einstein's field equations for the theory of general relativity. Just plain emptiness. Sentences like that make my mind go blank. With Kills and Hare's book and a bunch of other stuff I had read from researchers, I just was puzzled at why there was this part of psychopaths that you really only saw in really high scores the lack of moral sensitivity that I shared. Like, and that they, and kind of Brian specifically, but kind of also in general, were the first people that ever made sense to me. Everybody else just pretending around. So it was a mystery to me that caused me to research an ungodly amount about psychopathy, because I wanted to know, why am I like these people, but I'm not the same? Why are these the people that are, I can tell are from my fucking planet, whatever planet I was beamed down from, but I'm not the same as them. I don't have their disorder. Really about the crimes. It's just about it's hard to describe. I can't even describe it. They're just the first people I've ever related to. So anyway, I'm doing all this research on psychopathy, right? And I can't fucking stop seeing articles about Brian Dugan. In one article, a journalist wrote that Brian apparently said something along the lines of, he always wanted to be the hero. Or he wanted to be a hero. And he fantasized about having some opportunity to commit some heroic act that might change the way he was perceived. And I read that and I was like, me too. I want to be the hero and the villain. I believe you. I think you're totally genuine in that. I think Brian said that because he means it. I think he wanted to be both the hero and the villain growing up. And he picked one, went all in. Pick is kind of the wrong word, but I just could see that that wasn't fake at all. It wasn't Brian just trying to say something to be portrayed in a slightly better light, like he had some good in him. I believe that Brian actually thought, like, yeah, I'd like to be the hero. Because I did. That's what I thought since childhood, is I want to be a hero. And secretly, I want to be the villain too. Anyway, I don't remember how the idea came up, but eventually the thought occurred to me. It's like, I could write Brian. I was shocked to discover that instantly Brian and I had more in common than just the villain hero thing. I was like, oh my God. No ways. No ways I like talking to you in general. Outside of Scooby-Doo, my other favorite cartoon as a kid was Lilo and Stitch. And I used to pretend that Stitch was my imaginary friend. It would follow me everywhere. Even as a little kid, I never related to anybody and was always hoping one day I'd find a Stitch. I found him, guys. Guys, I found him. I didn't know this was possible. I didn't know you existed.
This is my family. I found it all on my own.
When I first met Brian, I did not believe that there was any chance in hell he had actually worked on himself and his character as a person. But time has proven me wrong. And Brian and I have met at a stage in his life where he has self-reflected for many years and been slowed down by age and 2 strokes to the point where we are now about equally dysfunctional individuals. But any earlier, and Brian had it bad. At one point you mentioned to me that you made a list of traits about yourself. When did you decide to do that?
In Joliet, everybody around me treated me different. I was still part of the whole, in some ways. I mean, lifted weights, I played games with them, handball, whatever. But I realized that I was a lot different, that my crimes were outliers, that put me in a different category than anybody else. So I made a list of, okay, let's see what you are. And I made a list of every bad quality I had in me, and I did that on the right side of the page. And I filled the whole page up all the way down. It was lined paper, at least 25, 26 of them, all the way down to the bottom.
Of negatives about your personality, the bad side.
Yes, but all of it. And I mean, everything on the hair checklist. And I didn't even know about the hair checklist before. But the positive side, I had two. I think that because I was such a bad guy, that people could manipulate me into doing bad stuff because I just would naturally gravitate to that side of the board instead of the positive side. I was predictable, in other words, and I wanted to be unpredictable too, and it would make me stronger. So if I had some good qualities, that would make me a better person, a stronger person, have better characteristics, and I could change myself a little bit. That's what I wanted to do, was see if I could change myself.
So you felt that if anyone came up to you with an idea to do this or that manipulative or illegal thing, you were much more susceptible to just going along with it. Is that accurate?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, if I know, sure. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, yeah. I mean, if there was a way to make money, I'd pretty much be in with most of the stuff. But I don't think that I would have committed like a murder or any kind of violent crimes unless it was like beating somebody up or like shooting somebody. Maybe like that kind of a thing. Not anything to do with a sex crime. I think that I was pretty much a loner for that stuff. I was at Pontiac, standing in my cell, and I was bored. There was nothing to do. And Ace came up to a cell right next door to me. He was downstairs, I was upstairs. Ace was a sex offender, he was a rapist. He had driven around Chicago with his victim that he picked up in Indiana, and he tricked her into the car, and then he left her in the back seat, and he was menacing her the whole time. He was terrifying her, and I didn't like him when he was my cellie. He was a cellie for a very short period of time. I still stood at the bars, and I wasn't really listening because I didn't pay attention to Ace. He was a piece of shit. And I couldn't help but overhear his conversation. And he was talking about doing legal work for the guy next door to me. And I knew that he was conning the guy next door. And it was the guy's only chance on an appeal, guy's last chance for freedom, and all Ace wanted was the money. $50, $75, whatever it was he was charging him. As he was talking, I kind of glanced at him, and I saw in his glib, lying little punk ass reflections of myself. I saw me in him, and I saw myself so perfectly reflected back at me, and I really despised Ace so much that it just turned my stomach. It hit me in the abdomen so hard, it was like being punched. It stunned me. It stunned me so bad that my cellie said, "Are you all right?" Because I physically said, "Oh." From that moment on, I really started to make a real effort to try to change who I was, because I didn't want to be like Ace at all. He was a greasy little bitch. He was weak. He wasn't real. He was phony. He was fake. He was a liar. He was a con artist. He'd destroy somebody else's last moment of appeal, last just for some coffee and some snacks. I mean, and that's really what I was, too. I was a phony. I was a liar. I wasn't real. I wasn't true. I wasn't anything but what society thought I was. I was an evil piece of shit. And I knew then just how low I was that it sickened me. And that's really the main catalyst for me wanting to change. And then I started meditating. I started trying to visualize what it was to be somebody else. I started to look at my victims and try to understand what they experienced because of me, the pain, the suffering, the fear, everything that was part of what my crimes were, and my intellectualization of what it is to empathize with somebody is a lot greater than it used to be. And I say I intellectualize because I don't know what you feel as empathy or what somebody else feels as their emotional aspects. I don't feel it to any great depth. It's like I'm like somebody who's colorblind. I mean, I don't know what red is. I don't know what blue is. I don't know what green is. You can describe what those colors are to me all day long, and I'll never understand what they are if I'm colorblind. And as far as emotions go, or empathy, it's for a psychopath, it's all washed out. It's black and white and gray, and it's not red, blue, and green. So we don't experience the richness and the color that everybody else does when it comes to empathy and emotions. And a psychopath has to do the work to put himself in the place of somebody else.
To me, emotions are like watercolor paint. I don't think that I lack any of the color or the vividness of emotional experience, but it washes over my brain and then it washes right back all the way out. I've definitely felt both sadness and fear at a level that's painful. But there's a certain level, it just felt like, well, that was just an experience I had. It doesn't mean anything. What I mean is, emotions to me are just like an experience, like a hit of a drug, like a psychedelic trip. After it's done, it's done. I remember it. I don't care about it. Look, I mean, psychedelic trips, they can mean something, right? It's not that it means nothing, but it wasn't real. You know what? I can tell I'm losing people with the psychedelics. Let's say it's like a hit of cocaine. It doesn't mean a damn thing after it's over. I have to imagine that I have some gaps with empathy. However, as someone with an overactive imagination and who has felt negative emotions at a painful level, I have full capacity to imagine and put myself in other people's shoes and genuinely relate to their pain. But you may have guessed that the problem with me relating to the pain of another person is that is an emotion I'm experiencing. And I don't give a shit about my emotions after they're done. There's a lot of thought going into the idea that disagreeableness is like a solid trait. Like you can't be both an extremely mean person and an extremely compassionate person. And I wouldn't say I'm an extremely compassionate person, but when I feel it, it's fucking real and genuine. I can see a complete stranger that nobody else is fucking helping and be pissed about the fact that no one's helping them and feel their pain and be moved to do whatever I can to make their day better. And then I can take a quick lap up and back down the street. And because I'm in a different frame of mind, I see that person get hit by a bus and not give a shit about them completely. Both are real. I both cared about that person enough to want to help them in that moment and did not give a shit about them 2 seconds later and probably thought it was funny. If I were to take a personality test on disagreeableness, I do not know where to fucking score myself because I do not give a fuck what you feel. But there are moments where I give a fuck when no one else does. And I'm not saying this to be a good person. I not only don't care if I'm perceived as a good person, I don't care about being a good person. And normally when people say that they don't care about something, it means they actually do. In my case, I fucking mean it. Up next.
Introducing Moral Insanity.
In 1835, an English physician named J.C. Pritchard introduced the term moral insanity in his book, A Treatise on Insanity. Moral insanity was basically like a giant expansion pack for the concept of madness without delirium. Pritchard's definition was
Madness consisting in a morbid perversion of the natural feelings, affections, inclinations, temper, habits, moral dispositions, and natural impulses, and without any remarkable disorder or defect of the intellect or knowing and reasoning faculties, and particularly without any insane illusion or hallucination.
The point being that just as the mental faculties can become deranged or damaged, so too can the moral faculties become damaged on their own, and that damage could suffice to be a serious mental illness. I explain this to say that Pritchard's original conception of moral insanity didn't necessarily mean that the person had any abnormality in their moral sentiments. In fact, he didn't exclude cases where only the emotions of an individual were affected, such as in depression or hypomanic states. And because of this, and because the English duly use the word moral to refer to affect and morality, many Americans at the time retermed Pritchard's concept as emotional insanity, which is mostly accurate, but it should be noted that Pritchard didn't exclude cases where the impulses or volition were predominantly affected. Daniel Hack Tuke and an English fellow named John Charles Bucknell wrote a manual together on the subject of insanity. And one of the examples of patients with such impulses describes his first instance being the impulse to go buy a pistol. This was a gentleman who'd never purchased a pistol, apparently, and never had an interest, but was overcome with the sudden, overwhelming desire to go get himself a pistol. They write that the patient himself was astonished and perplexed by the impulse. As a past subscriber to Guns and Ammo magazine, I am not perplexed. One lady became homicidal every time she was on her period. Disgraceful. Actually, there's two period cases. One where a woman would pursue anyone who displeased her with a knife. And he definitely didn't exclude cases where the moral sentiments were deranged. In fact, he took particular interest in those cases.
Some insane persons display their condition by a propensity to commit every species of mischief, though devoid of any feeling of malevolence. A case of this description, strongly marked, was lately pointed out to me in the York Lunatic Asylum. The individual is a youth of good temper, cheerful, and active, having no defect of understanding that could be discovered, even after long observation. He is continually prone to commit every kind of mischief in his power, and not long ago escaped from his confinement and made his way to Bishopthorpe Palace, with the design to set it on fire.
Third grade, I had a friend. We used to ride bikes together until I, put that snake inside the tea kettle and set the tea kettle on fire. And that snake started hissing, and I tossed him into the air and set the field on fire. After that, his mom wouldn't let me play with him. I mean, when I went over to his house, I went over there, and his mom just came out the front door and looked at me, like I was a zebra or something, and said, no, I can't play with you anymore. And she didn't say why, but I knew right then and there that he spilled the beans to his mom.
A propensity to theft is often a feature of moral insanity, and sometimes it is its leading, if not the sole characteristic.
It was the cases where people stole without any real desire for what they just stole that stood out to Pritchard as potential instances of moral insanity.
If anything, their drive for those goals, it may even be less than other people. The only thing is, when they even have a whim, just a thought that maybe might be interesting to try this or do this, they're likely to act on it.
Brian first got to be the hero in either the 6th or 7th grade when he started stealing packs of Slim Jims from the store and bringing them home to share with his brothers. He was the coolest for doing that. Brian became the hero again around the age of 13 when his friends were all hanging out on the back of a convenience store, and he'd walk in and go straight for the beer section and grab as much alcohol as he could and walk out with it. He'd take it around back and they'd all get drunk. Each time they run out, Brian would run back in and steal more alcohol, getting progressively drunker each trip until eventually the store attendant clued in to what he was doing because he was a completely intoxicated 13-year-old. Did you have a sense that you were different from your peers growing up?
I always felt like an outsider. Not when I was at the Catholic school. I was included in everything. The teachers treated me a little bit different, but I was always able to play marbles or whatever else they were doing when we were real short.
On some level, Brian didn't really know he was smart until he was an adult in prison and getting his IQ tested as a part of psychological tests for trial. He usually did below average in school, and part of that was because he struggled to pay attention in class, and he also suffered from excruciating migraines that he couldn't predict, and a lot of times that would happen randomly in the middle of the school day. One time when Brian was in Catholic school, he got really inspired by an essay that he was assigned to do, and he spent the whole weekend working his ass off on it. And when he turned it in the next week, the teacher thought it was so good that he didn't believe Brian had written it and failed Brian on the assignment. And that discouraged Brian. I also failed to mention Brian started doing drugs as early as a teenager and tried everything that came his way, just about, and continued that trend for all of his life as a free person and some of his time locked up too. Brian's stealing only escalated, and it didn't take long before he was breaking into random schools just kind of to poke around and see if there was anything to steal. And eventually houses, buildings, whatever.
Just ripping it on and getting high and drinking. And I skipped school. I used to go to school when I was a teenager and smoke weed, and I would make the whole hallway smell like weed. And this was the 70s, 72 probably.
Brian says he thinks the first time he got arrested was when he broke into a random middle school. I'm not sure if it was the same instance, but around 15, he spent some time at a youth home, court ordered. Just 3 days after Brian was released from the youth home, he and a friend broke into and robbed Kentucky Fried Chicken and got $4,000 cash. Now, $4,000 cash in the 70s, that's a lot of money for two teenagers. When Brian was 16, he officially dropped out of high school. And not long after, he was at a train station and he spotted a beautiful young girl and tried to sexually assault her. It didn't take very long for other physicians to begin shoo-shooing Pritchard's original concept of moral insanity and reserving it exclusively for cases where the moral sentiments had become perverted. Also important to note is that Pritchard mostly described moral insanity as something with an onset. That is, someone was normal and then they became afflicted with moral insanity. In a similar way, someone is perceiving reality correctly and then they slip into psychosis. A word or two on the congenital version of moral insanity. Pritchard notes in his book that there are cases of moral insanity that are difficult to treat because they are partly based on the person's inbuilt temperament. But he doesn't specifically go into depth about congenital moral insanity. That is, moral insanity starting at birth or near it. But he does lend support to the existence of these individuals later. And the Brits, with their inexhaustible charms, called this group moral imbeciles. So moral insanity is when you bump your head and you become a moral dum-dum. Moral imbecility is when someone whacks your mom in the stomach with a stick while she's pregnant with you and you're born a moral dum-dum. In Tuke and Bucknell's book, they specifically speculate about the existence of such a form. They talk about it as essentially analogous to imbecility. They know that many idiots are also moral idiots. But the question is, are there people who are not idiots who are moral idiots? They know a specific type of patient of an inert moral nature and animal propensities over which rewards, punishments, and threats offer very trifling control. As in, they're morally ambivalent, they do some wacky shit, and they're very difficult to train. He exhibited a total want of moral feeling and principle, yet possessed considerable intelligence, ingenuity, and plausibility. He has never, says Dr. Crawford, been different from what he now is. He has never evinced the slightest mental incoherence at any point, nor any kind of hallucination. He appears, however, so totally callous with regard to every moral principle and feeling, so thoroughly unconscious of ever having done anything wrong, so completely destitute of all sense of shame or remorse. When reproved for his vices or crimes, he has proved himself so utterly incorrigible throughout life that it is almost certain that any jury before whom he might be brought would satisfy their doubts by returning him insane. Another potential cause of moral insanity listed both by Pritchard but as well as many other authors after him is brain damage, plain and simple. Now, of course, in Pritchard's form of moral insanity, that'll include people who merely have changes to their affective states after brain damage, which is probably most people with brain damage. But the later writers talking about brain damage and moral insanity were using the term in the moral sense of the word. It's long been noted that there are many individuals who, after brain damage, commit first-time sex offenses or become violent and hostile where they weren't before. A recent paper investigating acquired criminality, as in people that were not criminals for life, but acquired it at some stage in adulthood, found that damage to the unsolate fasciculus, the white matter tract connecting the frontal and temporal lobes. So the tract running connections between them was in some way damaged or had lesions.
You had a couple instances
that caused probable brain damage as an infant?
According to my sister, and she's the only one that told me this story, she delayed my birth. The nurses strapped my mom's legs together. I don't know if they actually pushed me back inside of her, but she was in labor, and I guess they just strapped her legs together so that I couldn't emerge, and they did that because in the 50s and in the 60s, the early 60s, doctors couldn't get their fee. The obstetricians couldn't get paid a certain amount of money related to the birth, even though they did all this prenatal stuff and testing before, unless they were present at the birth. So that's what happened. The second one was I was living on Granite Street in Nashville, New Hampshire, my grandmother's house. She rented a downstairs place, and it was the winter time. I think I was colicky or teasing or something, and they put me outside to get some fresh air. My mom says fresh air, but I think in the middle of winter, you just don't normally do that. But they did. They put me outside on a porch. It wasn't enclosed, and the neighbor's cat crawled on my face, suffocated me. My mom came out and found me, and according to her, she took the cat and swung it over the fence back into the neighbor's yard. She's the hero. And I was taken to the local hospital and revived, and made me forward to Boston to a pediatric center to get evaluated and tested there. But I'm not really sure how true any of this is. It makes sense because I don't feel normal.
A case that I think is worth mentioning is in the year 2000, 40-year-old school teacher and family man, Mr. Oft, suddenly was afflicted with a strong impulse to look up child porn, which apparently he'd never done before. He started downloading very large amounts of child porn at his house and at work, started trying to persuade masseuses to give him a happy ending at the massage parlor, and eventually started making sexual advances towards his daughter. Daughter reported to wife reported it officially, and instead of going to prison, Mr. Off was given the option to go to a sexual rehabilitation center. But when he was in the program, he was unable to restrain himself from asking the woman in the program for sex. And so he was flunked from the program and set to re-enter prison. But the day before prison sentencing, Mr. Off checked himself into a hospital, saying that he was afraid he was about to rape his landlady. And while he was in the hospital, they observed a bit of wobbliness in his gait and requested an MRI for him. And they found an egg-sized tumor in the orbital frontal cortex.
You also had migraines starting. Well, when did they start?
Yeah, my whole life, since I can remember as a kid, all the way up until my mid-30s. Somewhere in there, they stopped.
What were the migraines like?
It was so painful that I had to fall asleep in order to get rid of them. I couldn't function. I had to lay down. And they were just completely overwhelming. The pain was like, it was behind my eye or in my forehead, the frontal lobes. I just couldn't function. I couldn't do anything. It was a sharp, aching, brain as a nine.
I should say that the orbitofrontal cortex is located within the frontal lobe, and that this region specifically has an association with antisocial behavior when it is in any way damaged. The tumor was surgically removed, and along with it went away his urge to look at child porn and his sexually inappropriate impulses. Eventually, he started developing a strong interest in looking at child porn again and started collecting it secretly. And eventually, they rescanned his brain and found that the tumor was back in the same spot. So no tumor, perfectly reasonable, normal, middle-aged man, no serious criminal record. Tumor, trying to commit every sex crime available to him. Important to note that Mr. Oft said that he was aware of the right and wrongness of looking at child porn and the sexual advances the entire time. But when he had the tumor, the pleasure principle, in his words, overrode his restraint. But when it was removed, restraint back. So where does Mr. Off's tumor case fall on our moral faculty checklist? Well, he for sure has impaired volition and inhibition. Did he have impaired moral feelings? We can't really say for certain, but he wasn't operating in a strong moral feeling state. Otherwise, perhaps he would have informed his wife that he was going to molest his daughter. In terms of emotions and affect, outside of the moral feelings themselves, Took family run Daniel Hack proposed that moral insanity at its core may just be a syndrome of disinhibition, that morality itself may be an inhibitory mechanism, and lacking moral emotions, empathy, shame, even remorse, meant you lacked inhibition. So basically, Took said, moral sentiments and inhibition are the same damn thing. But he said it nicer because he's a Quaker.
Had a couple of strokes in 2021. How do you think they affected you?
They affected me a lot. I think that they helped me in some ways. I mean, they were near-death experiences, and that means a lot. But I think that the damage, I'm not sure how they affected other parts of my brain. What parts were, I know that the back of my brain was damaged, and so those areas in the back of my brain, where the back of your neck is, that's the parts that had the stroke. But when I was repairing myself, when I was making a recovery, I noticed some differences in the way I was thinking and in the way I was processing information. I felt a little bit freer. I felt a little bit more in contact and in tune with the people around me.
One of the conditions that Pritchard talks about as a variant of moral insanity was a condition that was seen to strike patients in their old age as they were approaching their dying days, and that completely changed the moral character of the individual. Their previous social and moral qualities became completely eroded. He quotes a psychiatrist who said, "The pious becomes unpious."
The pious become impious, the content and happy discontented and miserable, the prudent economically imprudent and ridiculously profuse, the liberal penurious, the sober drunken.
He remarks on their perverted passions and their temper.
Impulses which had long been a feat become of a sudden excited, and a strong tendency to vicious habits is displayed.
This condition he describes, I can only assume, is the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia. And if it wasn't about FTD, it should have fucking been. Frontotemporal dementia is a neurodegenerative disease which causes shrinking of the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain. There are multiple types of this disorder and types of symptoms that it can cause, but the behavioral variant, with what we know about it, very cleanly checks off all three parts of the moral faculty list. The emotions and affective states of these patients change dramatically from what they were before. They become simultaneously apathetic and have largely blunted emotions, except when you irritate them, and they become extremely reactive and irritable, prone to outbursts and incredible spitefulness in some cases. In terms of volition and inhibition, they seem totally uninhibited. Totally. Past a certain point, Totally. And somewhat following in the moral sentiments domain, but also in the emotional and affective, they completely lose the capacity for empathy. Emotional empathy, that is. The first symptom of this variant of FTD is typically social inappropriateness. That could encompass making offensive jokes, where that would be out of the character of the person prior, or pissing in public, or starting to make untoward sexual advances. A Fantabulous 2023 paper makes the argument that when there are instances of older individuals committing first-time sex offenses, forensic psychologists should keep BV-FTD front of mind. In the article, they state about 8.9% of the crimes committed by people with FTD are sexual advances of some sort, which is sort of impressive when you compare it to another neurodegenerative disorder, Alzheimer's disease, which mainly affects memory and cognition, where the rate of sexual advance crimes is only 0.37%. There have also been many documented cases where people with FTD have developed late-stage pedophilia. Paraphilias are normally developed much earlier in life, normally in the adolescent years. So it's pretty unusual for them to develop for the first time in the 40 to 60 range when FTD usually strikes. The authors of the paper also speculate about whether there even exists the capacity in these patients for morality to govern their behavior anymore, and that they might entirely now lack the psychological processes necessary. Another article in the same journal lists some interesting examples of cases where people commit crimes in the early stages of FTD. One man in his 60s started following young children home from school and trying to molest them, and was ultimately arrested when he exposed himself to his neighbor's children. This patient had experienced personality changes for 4 years before this behavior started. Another patient, a woman in her 50s, after 18 months of personality changes, had frequently engaged in petty theft. She admitted that she knew what she was doing was morally wrong, but when asked why she still did it, she shrugged and said, "That's me." "Well, Bethany, it wasn't you 18 months ago." She was also asked about the recent death of a close relative, and she verbally expressed sadness over the death, but shortly after started laughing. In a German study investigating the rate of antisocial and criminal behavior among these patients, the study authors were able to interview 7 of the subjects and question them about their reasons for committing their crimes.
Not one of the 7 patients showed remorse or shame. Most did not see any need to explain themselves. One patient, who had scratched numerous cars with his umbrella, stated that he was angry because his driving license had been revoked.
You don't even need to be mad to do that. Hand me an umbrella in a parking lot and the urge will arise.
Another patient, who had regularly stolen food from shops, answered that he was not willing to pay so much money for the food.
My attitude when I used to shoplift was just keep raising the prices if you want, Kroger. But know this, Kroger, where there is a will to eat guacamole, there is a way. I've actually never stolen anything from a Kroger, and I don't remember if I ever stole guac, though it's not outside of the realm of possibility that I have. And $6.99? That's a very reasonable price. I'd pay $6.99 for just about anything. And I'm editing this homeless. But you know what you could use $6.99 for instead of 1 serving of guacamole? Check out our site, psychoswhobabble.com. Come join our little freak show. Only $6.99. Wow, what a steal. Coming soon, a Dugan family portrait. Prison Tells, stories from death row, and Psychobabbler, what was going on in Brian's brain the day before his final arrest. He'll tell ya. We are not responsible for any harm caused by the site. Side effects may include having a really good time. The researchers write that it's unclear why these patients commit these crimes. I don't agree, but that's me. Something to know is that these patients occasionally do experience false beliefs or some level of delusion, but they rarely experience full-blown psychosis, and the delusions on their own are not enough to explain the full scope of their antisocial behavior. Patients seem to understand legal and societal rules, yet display a diminished emotional concern for consequences. That is, there's a disconnect between the knowledge of criminal acts and any concern for avoiding them. These patients don't lose the capacity to understand morality and right and wrong on an intellectual level. They just stop giving a shit about it. Persons with BV, FTD may be indifferent to consequences, but in general, cognition is intact, and they understand the action and the likely result. They understand, they know, but they don't care. Which brings up an interesting question. Do these patients simply not care enough to follow social, moral, and legal rules? Or do they lack the capacity to follow them? I'm going to err on the side of saying it's either both, or past a certain point, caring about something and having the inhibition not to do it are the same thing. Something we're saying, though, is that FTD, even the behavioral variant, doesn't affect everyone equally or in the same way, and you can see different changes in behaviors for different people. In an interview with UChicago News, Dr. Bruce Miller says that around 40% of these patients will commit crimes that either do lead to their arrest or could. Dr. Miller regards the patients that he's seen as not responsible for most of their crimes.
I think of it as a moral decay. They don't have the apparatus in the brain to prevent them from committing these crimes.
And he goes on to say that most of the crimes committed are petty and silly, like driving through a red light even though a policeman is watching. Combination of disinhibition and poor judgment. But some of the crimes these patients end up committing are very serious. A particularly horrific case happened in 2022 on Thanksgiving Day, where an Albuquerque man disemboweled and dismembered his wife. His wife, Connie, said prior to the onset of dementia, Carlin was the sweetest, most caring man she'd ever known.
I opened the door. I saw pieces of her on the floor, and he was kind of in the bed, and he kind of looked at me. But there's pieces of her all over the bedroom.
What did you see, though? Did you see her hands, legs, face? Did you see?
Maybe her face.
You had said it's been building for years.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Just hatred, disrespect, that sort of thing. No, I just jumped out of bed and decided today was the day to inflict that much pain on Connie, unfortunately, and myself, and you guys, everybody. Yeah, I'm sorry that Connie got the worst.
He did also injure himself on the neck with a knife, but his injuries were not fatal. However, he did die 3 weeks later from his disease. That is, FTD had degenerated his brain to a point that would kill him in a matter of 3 weeks, and it was at that point of neurodegeneration that he committed one of the most atrocious acts possible. When this incident first became publicized and people were talking about the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia, I remember a lot of people commenting, trying to suggest that in order for Carlin to have done this, there must have been something already extra sick and twisted inside of him. And people said this in a way to try to place the blame back on Carlin and to deter people from placing the blame on the disease. But nobody knows that about Carlin. Couple things to say about this. First, yes, every individual's brain and personality is different. So if you damage a part of the brain that's involved in personality and decision making in two individuals in the exact same way, you're going to end up with different behavioral effects that are in part due to how that person's brain was originally wired or facets of their personality before the damage. But two, you cannot damage two individuals' brains in the exact same way, not by blunt force or disorder. There's no way to know exactly what neurons and connections between them are getting damaged or atrophied and in what order and what each of them do. So in Carlin's case, we actually don't know if the specific circuitry that was atrophied in those final stages coalesced to produce an extreme effect that you normally don't see in other patients, but that it was because of the very specific way his brain degenerated, which is somewhat random. The point being, the brain is fucking complex, okay? It doesn't matter if your herpes rash shifts this way or that way, 1/10 of a millimeter, but it fucking matters for the brain. But dude, even if he did have a lot of dark thoughts, he controlled himself and was a kind, loving person. I slammed the gavel on disorder's fault. I think that a key point to consider on the subject of moral insanity is whether or not the person's choices are illogical and self-defeating, right? So they might possess full intellectual capacity to reason and understand, but if their choices are consistently still illogical and self-defeating, I think they're insane. Good decisions are not just logical. Good decisions are based on what you value, and what you value is determined by what you feel about it, right? Not just reason. So if you find you don't give a shit about anything outside of occasionally a thing here or there in the moment, you're going to make really bad decisions. You might lack the capacity to make good decisions, in fact. And your decisions will probably harm others in some way, but they will also probably harm you. We believe that someone is insane if they lack the capacity to understand that what they did is wrong and or illegal. But part of understanding is the ability to emotionally appreciate what you intellectually know. This is my opinion. If you utterly lack the capacity to care about the consequences of your actions, even for yourself, are you not cuckoo for coconuts? When people ask, well, did the person with BV-FTD have the capacity to restrain themselves from committing the crime? What people are actually asking is analogous to asking if a car had defective brakes before crashing full speed into a tree. If the car had defective brakes, then no, in that moment, the car and the driver could not have stopped. But if the brakes still worked, well, then the driver could have braked, so why didn't they? And that's what people want to know. Do these people's brakes still work? Do they have the power to stop? Speaking to this analogy, a psychologist from the 1950s said,
in contrast with an automobile, the braking functions of the human organism are built into the personality by reaction to life experience. It seems likely that more fundamental than inadequate powers to refrain is the inadequate emotional reactivity upon which the learning to refrain must be based. Even with good brakes on his car, the driver must have not only knowledge of, but also feeling for what will happen otherwise, if he is to use them correctly and adequately.
And this is what these patients lack. They have lost touch with what not braking really means. They know what will most likely happen if they run the red light, piss in their neighbor's yard, chop up their wife, but they cannot feel the significance of those consequences. The significance of the possible arrest, fines, social alienation, and the pain that they'll cause to others is completely lost on them. There's actually another variant of FTD where most of the patients with it do have the same issues as BV-FTD, but they also have loss of semantic knowledge. It's the semantic variant or semantic aphasia. In this variant, patients gradually lose the meaning of words and objects and their function bit by bit over time. And in the early stages, they don't lose any language capacity, but they literally can't understand the words coming out of their mouth, even though they make perfect sense to the listeners. Both lose meaning. So while BV-FTD loses the grasp of meaning of consequences, aka their emotional significance, the semantic variant primarily loses semantic meaning, aka the ability to understand concepts. And many of the latter group actually lose both. That is, their ability to grasp the meaning of things is impaired across the board. The same psychologist we heard from on the subject of human breaking actually pointed out the comparison between the two. We hear people with BVFTD express a full understanding of the wrongness of what they've done, but that statement that they're making maybe as empty as the statements that many people with semantic aphasia make. It sounds like they understand what they're saying, but they actually don't.
What we take as evidence of their sanity will not significantly or consistently influence their behavior, nor does it represent real intention within, the degree of his emotional response, or the quality of his personal experience much more reliably than some grammatically well-formed, clear, and perhaps verbally sensible statement produced vocally by a patient with semantic aphasia can be said to represent such a patient's thought or carry a meaningful communication of it.
In fact, this psychologist went on to say that despite passing all verbal tests of sanity, these patients' self-destructive behavior across time revealed that they were as deeply disordered, as mad, and as insane as schizophrenic patients. Oh shit, what book am I reading? This is The Mask of Sanity by Hervey Cleckley. This wasn't about BVFTD. He was talking about psychopaths. Maybe in some sense emotions arise because meaning is interpreted first. Right? So there's an issue with interpreting the meaning of things that's not leading to the emotion rising. Like maybe the brain can determine significance first before the person actually feels something.
Emotions don't have any power if you don't attend to them. And actually, the reason that psychopaths appear to be fearless or without emotion is that they're not attending to the cues that would normally elicit those emotional responses.
And if it's the meaning or significance that is altered first and results in shallow affect, then maybe it is a form of semantic aphasia. Just a thought. Is it meaning or emotions or both? Ooh.
The punk kids I used to hang around with were no good pieces of shit. Thieves, liars, drug addicts. I mean...
Were you one of them?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's why they gravitated to me and I gravitated to them. Most of those guys were psychopaths. Most of those guys were able to stop what they were doing later on. They either met somebody, grew up, changed their behavior, stopped doing drugs, maybe had a kid and felt attached to the kid or the relationship and just wanted something different. They weren't searching the way I was still searching. They had what it was, the basic makeup to be human, but psychos are missing the parts of themselves that we can't really make up. And so I think that a lot of times psychopaths compensate with high-risk behavior or drug and alcohol abuse just to escape the reality of what they're living in every day. I mean, they're not really forming close attachments to anybody. You're the closest attachment to anyone I've ever felt. I mean, you just relate to me in a way that I never imagined was possible.
In my view, morality is just a game theoretic strategy for moving through the world and a matter of aesthetic taste. I actually took a game theory course in college, but I barely attended my classes in college. And when I did, half the time I got up 20 minutes into the lecture and left. And I didn't do any homework either that I didn't cheat on. So we're going to keep this simple. Suffice to say, actions made within social groups have consequences. And sometimes those consequences are downstream. So you might think it's cool to lie, cheat, steal, and manipulate because you think you can get away with it in one instance. And you might be right. But sometimes there are consequences that you can't predict that will happen down the line due to the interconnected nature of social groups. You might be closing off opportunities for yourself that you could have had in the future you would have had no way to predict because you did something that pissed the wrong person off however many years ago. People like to talk about morality like it's a useless thing in the way, and there's situations you could benefit if only you didn't have moral principles. And while that is true, there's actually better logical arguments to make for why you should be moral and why that will benefit you more in the long run, at least the majority of the time, not all the time. You can make many good arguments for why you should be honest and not still, even when it looks advantageous to do so in the moment, because you might be wrong in the long run. But I don't give a shit about that. I like to roll the dice, and so do a lot of people. And I think this is a misconception people have that, well, psychopaths are like Spock. They are not like Spock. The point of psychopaths is, despite perfect reasoning abilities, they are making illogical decisions. Life might be a game on some level that you can win, but I don't play games just to win them. I play games to have fun. If I have to play a long game in a really boring way just to win it, it's not worth it to me. I want to have fun. People play games to enjoy them. And people hope that they enjoy their lives. Most people are doing it for one of two reasons. They want to win or do as best they can at the game, and that brings them joy and meaning. And B, they are enjoying playing it with other people, and that mere fact gives them joy and meaning. Some people cheat because they care so much about winning that they're willing to take that risk. Other people cheat because they are so bored of the game and they find that cheating is way more fun than playing the game normally. And those people cheat too much and get kicked out from playing. Those are your psychopaths. And there is another group of people who also are not enjoying playing the game, but keep trying to play normally till one day they get fed up and chuck the board against the wall. And those are your mass killers. Meaning is not just an abstract question. It's an experience. You experience things as being meaningful or not. And some people experience less meaning than others. What I mean by that is things that are meaningful and keep most people going day to day, even though it's still a struggle for everybody, don't strike other people as meaningful. If there are very few things that you can experience as being meaningful, if the normal things that give people's lives meaning just don't do it for you and don't give you that same experience of meaning, it makes it very hard to see a reason why you should play the game like other people. To play the game as if it has meaning for you when it doesn't. The rules of the game and how the way you play affects other players only matters to you if you can see meaning in those things. The most common way for someone to lose the meaning of playing the game at a level where they want to check out is they stop seeing the point of their life and they take themselves off the board. But that is a partial loss of a sense of meaning. The full loss of a sense of meaning is when you are disconnected from caring and enjoying the fact that you're playing with other people to the same degree everyone else does, and caring about how you do at the game in the long run. If you lose touch with both those things, you are not going to care about abiding by the rules of the game or how you play relative to other people. AKA, you're not going to care about morality. People who are depressed and kill themselves don't lose complete touch with the meaning of the game at the level of, say, a psychopath is disconnected from the meaning of the game, or someone who goes to the top of the bell tower and shoots a bunch of people has become disconnected from the meaning of the game. Now, that's the logic of morality. The feeling of morality I experience on the level of aesthetic taste. Let's take a step back and talk about art for a minute. Now, I've heard that some people only want to watch happy movies and only want to hang pretty art on their walls. I might make fun of you for this, but there's nothing wrong with it. I too can appreciate art that's just happy and pretty, but my aesthetic taste in art is a hell of a lot broader than that. Some people only like art that's light, and they don't like art that's dark thematically. But to me, and to many people, whether a painting is light or dark thematically has nothing to do with whether or not it's a good painting. A painting is good, or any kind of art is good, when it strikes you as meaningful. You look at it, watch it, read it, and some part of it speaks to you and moves you. In whichever way, it's meaningful to you. Whether it's paintings, books, movies, music, the point of art is to try to capture meaning and express that to the viewer. And we find art good and interesting when it does that successfully. And an ugly and disturbing painting can do that as well as a beautiful and colorful painting. Now, not everyone feels that way. Some people only like art that is beautiful and happy. And that is partly because of their personality. And I think mostly because of their disgust sensitivity and their fear sensitivity. I think that actually determines how adventurous you are at art. If you're very sensitive on those things, you are not going to like art that is dark or ugly. It's not going to be meaningful to you. You're just going to hate it. But if you have a low sensitivity to both those things, it opens up a world of spectrum of art that you can enjoy and appreciate. I am like off the end of that spectrum of I can enjoy everything. But I'm not just talking about art. For me, I experience morality in the same exact way as liking or disliking a painting. Take a walk with me through an art gallery for a sec. We see a bunch of paintings in there. Some of them are traditionally beautiful, light and colorful. Think the Sistine Chapel's depiction of angels in the heavens. And other paintings are a little more dark or disturbing. Sometimes they're even ugly. Think Baroque devils and demons. You look at those darker paintings and say, oh, I don't like that. That's an awful painting. Oh, get it out of here. And I'm like, well, actually, no, that's a good painting. You just have an aesthetic preference that I don't share. I don't have your same aesthetic limitations, dude. Now you might think, I wouldn't do that. I can appreciate thematically darker paintings. Well, let's say the art gallery was depicting bestiality pictures and child porn. I have my own sense of aesthetic taste. It's not that I don't have things I like and dislike, but I experience that like and dislike on the level of aesthetic taste. In the same way you dislike or like a painting, I would say that's wrong or right. I dislike that. It is the same effective loading for right and wrong for me. And to complicate matters, there's no genre I don't like. So just because something's bad doesn't mean I'm going to like it. But just because something's bad doesn't mean I'm not going to like it. I am not saying I'm right to see things this way. But I am saying that whatever it is in the brain that causes people to go, that is disgusting or wrong, never developed for me. Something I think really worth noting is that most of Pritchard's descriptions of what moral insanity looks like sound a lot like the prodromal phase of schizophrenia. It's almost as if Pritchard is describing a prodromal phase that never develops into psychosis. Pritchard's idea specifically was that the moral faculties were deranged, but not the intellectual or the mental faculties. But the revolutionary idea was not that the moral faculties could become deranged. It was long thought that in most or many cases of typical insanity, the moral faculties were just as deranged as the mental. In fact, Esquarel wrote,
There are insane persons whose delirium is scarcely noticeable, none whose passions and moral affections are not disordered, perverted, or annihilated.
So people who experience psychosis, at the very least, while psychosis is occurring, if not after or between episodes, there are observed issues with volition and impulse control, some sort of change to affective states, whether it's a corresponding mood issue or just blunted affect. And it's been shied away from for a long time, but moral sentiment changes in at least some patients who experience psychosis. So in theory, each three of these groups maps to potentially a separate disorder that just appears similar to each other, right? As in all disorders cause psychosis, but each one maps to possibly something different that's going wrong in the brain that's similar to everyone in that group, but different from the other groups, even though they all look similar and blurry and what the hell. You have to imagine, say, if it's the same disease causing everything for type 1, but only some of them have mood issues, that possibly the disease is affecting different parts of the brain in those patients despite being the same disease or disorder, right? So who's to say that it couldn't also affect other regions of the brain a little bit, such as, the prefrontal cortex or the unsolite fasciculus or the region around the amygdala, that there couldn't be a subset of people where in some way those regions are a little bit more affected than others. I would suggest that just like in each of these groups of disorders that can affect the brain, mood problems may or may not happen. Also, probably moral disturbances may or may not occur in each of these groups. The idea being, of course, that many people with these psychosis-inducing disorders would never experience this as a symptom at all. But some would experience some episodes where potentially the parts of the brain involved in moral decision-making are affected. And others, it would be like a pretty constant or persistent feature with varying degrees of severity. If it just is the case that these disorders can affect, the frontal lobes or any other part of the brain that potentially is involved in moral decision-making, you're gonna see cases, maybe just episodes, where someone's displaying behavior that's kind of like FTD. You may have heard that there was a neuroscientist that scanned his own brain and found he had the brain of a psychopath, James Fallon. That's not true. He was not a psychopath. He had the same job for multiple decades and maintained a family and good relationships with his kids. I read James's book 10 years ago, so my memory of the details is a little foggy, but I actually remember him saying something like he used to love his wife, but now he wasn't so sure anymore, and he wasn't sure if that memory was accurate. Like there had been a change. While all fMRI findings and observations should be taken with a great amount of skepticism, it's possible that James was seeing something interesting on his fMRI scans because his bipolar type 2 was doing something interesting to his brain. It was affecting the moral faculties, which didn't make him full-blown morally insane or like a psychopath, but did result in some apathy and loss of empathy that his family could detect. I recently read a beautifully written paper/study on the topic called The Judgment of Moral and Social Transgression in Schizophrenia. In the paper, they explored the idea that moral judgment might be compromised in individuals with schizophrenia, or a subgroup of them. They note that not all of the crimes committed by schizophrenics happen when they are under the influence of a delusion, hallucination, or some thought disorder. And it was noted by the authors that in the 19th century, physicians observed that many of the patients that would be diagnosed with schizophrenia today displayed moral insensitivity and poor moral judgment. They gave each of the participants 16 statements to rate. Half of them were moral violations, like, I punched your mom in the face because she's a hoe. And the other half were rule-breaking violations or conventional violations, like, I skipped third period because my teacher's a hoe. They were interested in whether or not patients could differentiate between the moral and the conventional violations. And part of the reason they were interested in this is because there were some studies that showed that people with psychopathy had an impairment in distinguishing between moral and conventional rule breaking. But I do need to say that that finding about psychopathy has been called into question, and there's been other studies that have been failed to replicate those findings, as in the psychopaths don't show a significant difference in distinguishing between moral and conventional violations. Still, because the schizophrenic and schizoaffective patients in this study didn't have trouble making the moral and conventional distinction, they concluded that these patients did not show any moral judgment impairments. But interestingly, they also state that these patients had slower reaction times to evaluating the moral statements versus the rule statements, meaning they reported normal judgments on the moral statements, but they were significantly slower than controls to do so. In fact, the authors even speculate that it's because of a diminished effective response that they are unable to do this quickly. And this is actually extremely similar to patients with psychopathy. Patients with these disorders have often been noted for their indifference, which is sometimes chalked up to blunted affect, which is not necessarily the same as having shallow affect. With blunted affect, you can still experience emotions to the same degree. You just have difficulty displaying them with facial expressions and body language. But two things can be true at once, and there may be some diminished affect in there as well, at least in some cases. That's not to say that the way these patients answered was the same as what you see in psychopathy. In fact, they rated social violations actually harsher than controls, which is something you frequently see in autistic traits, which can overlap with these schizoid disorders. And there's an argument to be made that maybe there's impaired theory of mind. But I would argue that these patients are experiencing a deficit of moral feeling, which slows them down, but they are still giving similar answers to controls on the moral questions because they know the right answers, just like psychopaths know the right answers, but also have a deficit of moral feeling. But as we've seen, merely having an understanding of right and wrong and being able to discern between the two logically doesn't mean there isn't a feeling deficit, and that feeling deficit may become apparent when volition is impaired, which it sometimes is in schizophrenia. As we've learned with psychopathy, the only true blue test of this is manifest in real-life behavior, not what they report to you on a questionnaire. But I think at least part of the reason why the authors didn't consider this possibility is because they were mainly interested in being able to demonstrate moral judgment errors that could, in some capacity, be presented to the court as evidence of some form of mitigation or diminished responsibility for a crime. And thus far, demonstrating that someone simply lacks moral feeling has not worked as a mitigation strategy. No one really wants to acknowledge the idea that both psychotic derangement is going on and moral derangement, both caused by the disease. Everyone is hoping to find some cognitive impairment that explains it, or to write it off as another delusion, because the law doesn't give a fuck if they're morally insane at the time. And this person who's extremely sick, who probably would not have done the same thing if they weren't extremely sick, is going to face harsh consequences from the law. And I'm not saying if someone is just morally insane that they should be given a free pass, but it should be considered as mitigation. The law just doesn't want everyone who commits any crime ever to say that they were morally insane and claim mitigation. Sorry, I didn't feel like it was that bad. To the author's credit, they do suggest that there may still be a subtype of schizophrenia that does involve impaired moral judgments, and they suggest further research in forensic facilities. And I fully believe that there is such a subtype. Most schizophrenic patients are not violent, but having a diagnosis of schizophrenia greatly increases your risk of violence and homicide. If you look at this another way, it may be the case that there are many individuals with schizophrenia where the specific way that the disorder affects them does not put them at basically any substantially increased risk of violence. And on the other hand, there are other people with schizophrenia where the specific way their disorder manifests and affects them puts them at incredible risk of extreme violence, even more than what the statistics would suggest. There are many family members of individuals with schizophrenia who are caring for them and who, whether they want to admit it or not, are afraid because they realize that there is the potential for them to have a violent outburst. And unfortunately, for these people who both adore their mentally ill family member, but also fear what they could do in the wrong moment, there are very little resources available. What I remember from growing up is that when my parents called the cops late at night to intervene and hopefully de-escalate a situation where my brother might have done something, we were told that unless he threatens to commit suicide or commits an actual crime, there's nothing we can do. And the messaging is basically, we have to wait until they commit a crime. You will not get any help until they commit a crime. And after that, the help will be very haphazard, let me tell you. So the reality that a lot of people live with is that they actually sit there and hope that the person they're caring for commits a small, nonviolent crime so that they might be institutionalized and finally receive the help that they need. But oftentimes that doesn't happen. What happens is eventually that person does commit a serious crime, a violent crime, and tragically, that violent crime is often committed against their caretakers, the people who have been begging for help. Super interesting recent study, 64 patients were presented with a series of vignettes, some moral, good, and some immoral, bad, and they were asked to rate them on a series of essentially moral scales. One of the things they were asked to rate the vignettes on was moral appropriateness. And for the positive moral vignettes, they rated them as appropriate as did controls. But they also rated that there was more self-interest involved in the vignette action, as in they would personally benefit from it more. And in the immoral vignettes, they rated it as less inappropriate than controls did. So they didn't perceive the immoral vignettes as being as strongly negative. The authors write in the discussion that schizophrenic patients have an appreciation for prosociality. That is, they see how prosociality benefits them, but they may still lack some moral feelings about it. Which is interesting. But again, they are underrating how wrong the immoral actions are. So there may be a case here where they have subdued moral feelings in general, but their behavior in general when medicated is not overtly antisocial because these patients understand how prosociality benefits them. That's one thought. Even if it is the case that these people's moral sentiments and feelings haven't changed or gone anywhere, it just takes maybe longer to access them. If it takes someone longer to determine whether something's right and wrong, and they have impulse control issues, which people with schizophrenia frequently do, that's still a recipe for disaster. One of the authors used the term morally unstable, and I think that might be accurate, as in unstable feelings about right and wrong. But it only really becomes an issue if those fluctuations in ability to access moral feelings about things is more persistent, which it might be in some cases, or two, it just happens to coincide with a bout of impulsivity. Like potentially someone could have an episode where they just are not inhibited in the normal way. Like kind of the concept is if it affects a lot of people with schizophrenia, it may more be a thing where just like other symptoms can come and go, so too can being in a state where you're not really able to access the moral feelings of feeling this is right or wrong in a strong way that'll influence your behavior. And that on top of an impulsivity issue. And that would be an episode where they are snip, snip, morally kind of batty for a little bit. In the same way FTD patients are kind of morally batty for a bit. Couple caveats. Individual results may vary. This needs to be replicated on larger sample sizes. And it may not be the case that every patient with schizophrenia has any reduction in moral feeling. It needs to be investigated. But I'm pretty certain there's at least a subgroup that does. One study found that past a certain point, high psychopathy scores on the PCLR indicated preserved metacognition in schizophrenic patients, meaning that the ability to govern and monitor one's own thought processes was preserved, which is actually not all that surprising because at least the interpersonal traits on the PCLR require some level of preserved metacognition. The items like manipulativeness and superficial charm, for example. Which leads me to the interesting thought that there might be even more patients with schizophrenia who would score pretty high on the PCLR if their metacognition was intact. Just a wild-haired thought for a wild hair day. If there is a subgroup of schizophrenic patients who do become morally insane on top of developing psychotic symptoms, you would not expect the schizophrenic patients to immediately present like psychopaths, even if they did have a similar moral dysfunction going on in the brain, because one, the addition of psychotic symptoms, two, it was a condition with an onset. They didn't develop this way since birth, and so they develop socially in a different way. And three, because there are sometimes impairments to cognition that prevent the interpersonal characteristics from developing. Oh, and negative symptoms like avolition. So they might be too lazy to go do impulsive stuff. Look, they're not the same, but I think this is a thought experiment worth having to think on. So if there are subgroups within subgroups of people with psychosis who, in addition to experiencing psychotic symptoms, also experience varying degrees of moral insanity, what about those people when they're in the prodromal phase? Does the moral insanity bit start first? Our Quaker friend, Tug, actually speculated about this and about the prodromal phase specifically.
What if a crime is committed when a patient is in this early stage of disorder? Is he not to that extent the subject of emotional or moral insanity? Is the fact altered because in a few more months, distinct delusion succeeds to emotional disturbance?
The first sign that was noticed that indicated my brother was in the prodromal phase of schizophrenia was inappropriate behavior, such as wearing a Santa Claus hat to church. Now, in my brother's case, I'm sure he would have found the idea of wearing a Santa Claus hat to church funny before the onset of the illness. But it wasn't until he was hitting the prodromal phase that his inhibition was lowered enough that he would actually do stuff like that. My Uncle Steve was a fun-loving, charismatic guy his whole life. He loved hunting, trapping, riding motorcycles and dirt bikes. He had a Mustang and a Bronco. One of the guys that he raced with the motorcycle said that Stephen was crazy and had to win. And according to another uncle, was a fantastic leader and foreman and could play the backhoe like a violin. He was skilled at pretty much everything he did, and he went hunting with his brothers once and would not get out of the sleeping bag and didn't want to participate. But a deer walked nearby camp, and he just whipped out a rifle from his sleeping bag and shot it dead. The first kill of the trip. He actually found a dead body in a creek one time, which I think is interesting. My mother thought he was a meanie growing up. And sometime in adulthood, my mom baked a huge batch of cookies, and Stephen spit on all the cookies the moment he saw them to claim them, which I respect. He did serve a Mormon mission, but he was in and out of activity with the church because it's scandalous for the Mormon community. Part of the legend of my uncle is that in midlife, he started having three-ways and rotating between meth, coke, and speed week to week to not get addicted to any of them, and also drank heavily, smoked pot, and grew mushrooms. Eventually, his wife divorced him, and he, in 1998, molested one of his daughters. Around the same time, he was driving on a suspended license and did not show up for his court date. Stephen, at the time, was living on my grandfather's property in a trailer, and my grandfather had heard that he got arrested but didn't know what for, so he asked him what he was in trouble for. Stephen ran to the trailer, and my grandfather followed him and banged on the door. Then Stephen swung open the door and kicked my grandfather in the stomach so hard that it split open and his intestines fell out. And then he pinned my grandfather to the ground and held a gun to his head and demanded the title of a car. Stephen was 37 years old when all this happened, and it wasn't until his early 40s that he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. I believe that Stephen was probably a bit like me, and unfortunately his excessive drug use in midlife triggered a psychotic illness to begin. In 2005, Stephen went missing for a month until someone had the idea to check the family shed on my grandfather's property, and they found him hanging from a noose, rotting. I don't know if Stephen was experiencing psychotic symptoms when he molested his daughter, but I don't think it matters. I don't think Stephen would have done it if he had not been starting to develop schizophrenia. Let's talk about an internet icon, schizophrenic serial killer Joe.
Meet Joe Kellinger, currently serving a life sentence for sex-related murder here at the State Hospital for the Criminally Insane.
Now, Joe is kind of a one-off. There's not very many schizophrenic serial killers, but all serial killers are kind of a one-off. So why bring him up? No one's going to like that you're bringing him up. He's a one-off. Well, because I want to.
When Kellinger's reign of terror ended, 3 were dead, including his 14-year-old son.
And he reports that he killed his son because he was under the delusion that it was a
sacrifice to see if I could murder one of my own.
But I dare say there's also the presence of extremely abnormal moral feelings.
Do you ever feel violent?
Yes, I do.
What do you feel like doing?
Killing people.
Do you think you'd murder me, Joe?
Yes.
That's gruesome, Joe. That's horrible.
Yes, it is.
If one looks beyond the words.
And you don't blame me if I say I hope you never get out of this place.
I hope I never do either.
And gauges the affect, the emotion, the feeling that goes with them. At that point, you start to see a disconnect with what he's saying and what he's experiencing. And I think that is characteristic of psychopaths.
Whoops, wrong video. With Joe, we have a conundrum. Is he killing people because he's hallucinating, or is he killing people because he likes it? Both. Joe found he likes killing people. Joe appears to only kill people when he hallucinates. Are these separate coalescing phenomena, Or is it possible that schizophrenia, in Joe's individual case, is playing a role in both things? It is creating hallucinations, and it is altering the way that Joe processes emotions and rendering his moral sentiments unstable.
I'm a patient person, got a good listening ear, and try to help people.
You're patient with a good ear, and you try to help people.
Yes.
When you're not trying to murder them.
Yes.
And being gripped by the hallucinations, or the fact that the hallucinations are coming from an uptick in a psychotic state that may independently lower his inhibitions, may be the trigger that causes him to kill people, even though Joe seems to want to kill people all the time.
Gruesome, Joe.
Definitely not going to say that schizophrenia is the only factor in why Joe liked to kill people, but I think it does affect the way he feels about the fact that he kills people and how muted it seems to be, at least in this interview. And no, I don't think it's just because his affect is blunted and he's secretly crying on the inside. Nor do I think that it makes any sense to just write off his obvious lack of deep remorse as a product of delusion. Joe is aware that he killed people for delusional reasons in this clip. He still is not experiencing remorse about it because schizophrenia is still affecting the emotional centers of his brain to the point where he can't. Also, this interview makes it seem like it's a very clear-cut case, and Joe only killed people or did bad things when he was hallucinating.
I don't think anyone has a right to take a life.
Except you?
When I'm under hallucination, I do.
Joe actually did other things except kill people. He actually took one of his sons on a burglary and rape spree. And for that son that he did kill, he actually took out a life insurance policy on that son before killing him. In some early trials, psychologists questioned whether Joe was actually schizophrenic or just had schizoid and paranoid personality features, features that you sometimes find in the families of schizophrenics, but that don't necessarily mean you're going to experience psychotic symptoms. By the time that this interview was conducted, it was pretty clear that Joe really did have schizophrenia and really did have psychotic symptoms. But in my opinion, throughout the entirety of his life, it's real difficult to say how much of it was due to psychotic symptoms and how much was due to moral insanity. And by the way, the personality features that some psychologists thought was the extent of what Joe was afflicted with are, at least historically, meant to be captured by schizoid personality disorder and schizotypical, which are two disorders that actually are way overrepresented among serial killers. Like half can be diagnosed with either of those.
That's when you realize that none of it has touched him.
I was branching out. That's when the cannibalism started. At first, it was just curiosity.
Same as with schizophrenia, most people with these personality disorders are not remotely violent. But there is a small problem group among them that is. There was actually a Greek study that showed while people with antisocial personality disorder who were in Greek prisons committed the most crimes overall, it was actually the schizoid and schizotypical personality disordered people that committed the most violent crimes. There really are just the two main groups of disorders where people hit the news for committing extremely disturbing acts. On the one hand, you have psychopathy. So people like Ted Bundy and unfortunately Brian. On the other hand, you have your schizoidy types. So people with schizoid or schizotypical personality disorder like Jeffrey Dahmer or the Unabomber. And in the liminal space between those two groups, you will find your Batman villains and Art the Clown and me. If I wake up on the wrong side of the bed. After starting off adulthood by immediately dropping out of college and accumulating one of the worst job histories possible in the shortest amount of time, and getting myself stranded with a negative balance in my bank account in Ukraine, and also not having any fun. Ukraine was fun, though. At a certain point, I realized, despite my delusions of grandeur, I was falling way behind all of my peers. And because I was actually ahead of my peers in high school, the narcissistic injury that it inflicted upon me was very severe. Well, it actually wasn't then, but it was when I went to college again and decided to try and kept fucking up over and over and over. Even though I knew the problem was me, I couldn't get me to fix it. And I'd sit at home and self-flagellate, and then I'd end up back in class the next day and still 20 minutes in be filled with delusional chemicals that I didn't have to be there and leave. And what I would do is get high and walk around downtown and shoplift instead all day. And every day I'd be like, tomorrow's different. I'll do it right tomorrow. And every day I did it again. And I was very aware of the pattern but couldn't fix it. Yeah. I literally could not believe that I could not fix it and just get myself to do the bare minimum of doing 50% of my homework and attending 50% of my classes and paying attention. And I realized I might be the most undisciplined person on the planet Earth and decided to work on my discipline. And I kept trying for many years, and I did successfully live a normal life. Until I got sick of it and blew the whole thing up.
And it reaches speeds up to 35 miles an hour under certain conditions.
I don't have a criminal record. And that is mostly deserved. I don't think winning the game in life matters. Not having the most money, being the most successful, the most well-respected, sinless, whatever. None of that matters. We're all gonna... You should be mindful of the rules of the game of life because you do not want to get kicked out and be extremely restricted for the rest of your life on what you can do and enjoy. Brian has reported that prison is nowhere near as fun as it used to be. There was a time when it was fun, and we all missed it. Born in the wrong generation. The days of Spec snorting cocaine off of someone's cock are over. Dead and gone. Anyone who would like to commit crimes that will result in them going to prison should not, because we need to protest these prisons. They do not allow for enough fun. We must all abstain from crime so that we do not go and support their cruel enterprise. I don't view life as a game. I view living as a creative act. And all of our actions are little brushstrokes on the canvas of our lives. But it's true. Every little brushstroke of a decision gets a color. And the color is determined by the moral right or wrongness of that choice. If you want the really pretty colors, the light and bright ones, all this garbage on my shirt, you have to make basically altruistic decisions. It's got to be a really high up on the good spectrum choice if you want to pick a really pretty color to use. Now, if you want to make shit decisions, then there is a palette for you. It's called the crapulence palette. Brian calls all his worst decisions his crapulence. Okay? Full of the worst shit colors you could possibly fathom, and some we can't even perceive with the naked eye. But you will detect them because they all stink. And most choices that people could make are just muted, boring colors on either the light or the dark side of the spectrum. What the painting of your life looks like in the end is colored based on what choices you make and how you make them. Now, not all lives are meaningful lives, just like not all paintings are meaningful. To some degree, it's in the eye of the beholder. But whatever you choose, good or bad, make something meaningful to you. If you want a meaningful life, you have to create one. And you create one with your choices. However, I would dare say you should not decide ahead of time what a meaningful life looks like for you and try to reach it with all these goals. I am anti-goal. Goals have never done me any good. They've only gotten me a life I don't want. You can have short-term goals, but you should be open to go where the wind blows at all times. For some people, living the normal way is inherently not meaningful. With normal goals of go to school, get a good job, have a successful career, have a family. For some people, these goals in and of themselves are not meaningful enough to just strive for on their own. You can struggle and strive and get these goals. But do you actually want the life it creates for you? I ask you. I would say don't. Maybe the average person should do that. But for people who are creative or dysfunctional or know they could potentially shoot up a building one day, don't try to do the normal thing. Try to make decisions that are meaningful to you and true to yourself. But don't just make decisions without thinking about them. Think about them first and decide what really sings to your heart and soul. Make those decisions. And try not to get high all the time. It'll fuck it up. You don't have to have a plan, but you do have to think about your actions before you take them. I get the appeal of just making a big giant shit mess on the canvas, because I also see that as way more appealing than just painting a normal, boring painting. But there's already been a lot of people that just go to their graves having made a shit mess. Make a life that only you can make. Follow the things inside you that interest you and you alone. Make the decisions for yourself that nobody else agrees with, but only you do. But consider using some of the pretty paints in that picture. Every single one of us has light and dark in them. There is no human being that doesn't have light in them. What we have are human beings who are moral idiots like me, but who are also very impulsive and short-sighted on top of that. And so they end up making very base and banal decisions. And what we also have in society are people who are partial moral idiots, but are continuing on, despite it all, to make their boring paintings and lose it and splatter shit everywhere one day. Make a painting only you can make. Reach for some of the better colors. You can do better than a poo-poo painting, okay? I'm here to tell you right now, you can all do better than a poo-poo painting. It's been done, it's not interesting anymore. If you poo-poo out your painting, you will never get to see what you could have made, what your life could have been. If you had just been yourself, but thought a couple steps ahead on your decisions. And for those mass killers that do paint a normal painting and then poo-poo it one day, I get you. I don't always understand your convoluted motivations, but I relate to the feeling. If all of your fantasies are nothing but mayhem, change your life. You also should not just be painting with the boring colors the whole time. Make decisions that are different from the norm, not just one big decision all at once. Make other decisions that are different and align with your true self, your deep core. And I'm just gonna say it. If you cannot care about dying in your mass killing, you cannot care about your bills. Explore your options. Don't just do the things other people tell you need to do and then collapse under the pressure and the weight of those meaningless things. Oh, but I didn't forget about the pedophiles and the rapists. I can't recommend BDSM sex clubs to anybody because I would never attend that cringy shit. I can only recommend masturbation. In addition to being a place that houses Brian's personal writings about his life and experiences, Psychos Who Babble is also going to have our texts that basically show a very straight up, honest portrait of our love story. If I'm a predator, I'm like a retarded wolf in sheep's clothing that went off task and actually tried to befriend the sheep instead of eat them. But all the sheep side-eyed each other and said, "There's something wrong with that sheep." So now I'm just a retarded costume wolf frolicking in the farmfields. I sport a buzz cut, salt pepper hairstyle, short white scruffy facial hair, and carry a quad cane for protection against sexually aggressive women. Unequivocally and without reservation, I like you. I like you too, you fucking cunt. You need to give them I love you. I love you too. There's gonna be a lot of cool shit on this site. You don't even know what's gonna be on this site. We don't even know what's gonna be on this site. Come find out with us. Come chat. We want to hear your questions. We won't go into details about the murders.
That there must be war. I don't know what they're fighting for, but I'm glad my wife's in Europe, 'cause she can't get back to me.
This is a reverse time capsule message. The rest of you, get out of here. School wasn't working out because you weren't meant to be there. You were not interested enough in what you were doing. You were never going to have one career path based on going to graduate school and staying in that one lane, doing the same thing forever. You were not the kind of person. You knew you didn't want that, but you still wanted to prove you could be one of those people. Stop it. Get help. You are smart enough to do that, yes. You don't have to prove that to the plebs. You were not disciplined enough to do it, no. But that doesn't mean you can't do other things. And if you're gonna keep trying, let go of your ego and choose a different major than math. I did get a bachelor's and I did work in a call center doing customer service after. No, I don't want to talk about it. You started to consider that maybe you were wrong and you were the problem with everything you wanted to do and be. And you were right about that on some level. But you should never have taken anyone else's advice. Their advice was not made for you. You should have kept trying to live life your way. And your way might be designed to end in suffering, but it's your way. You went on from college and slowly continued to try to work on your discipline with very mixed results and some good results, and ultimately put yourself in a position in life where you could have a good career on the horizon, and you were married, and then you blew up your entire life like you always knew you would. And the only thing I discovered is the only discipline that's worth a shit is the discipline not to do something that will get you arrested. Otherwise, discipline is crap. If you are interested enough in what you're doing, you will have some intrinsic motivation to do it and to get better at it. And if you don't have that, you're at the wrong place. If you are at a boring menial job, you max out at 3 months there. If you get a job that is more mentally stimulating and has room to grow and learn, you max out at a year. Don't expect yourself to be able to stay longer. Give yourself the freedom to be able to bounce around. Don't expect yourself to act like a normal person. There are consequences to only working at jobs short term, but you are the type of person that can deal with them. Don't fight yourself so much. Just don't get yourself life in prison because you can't rebound from that. I am like 2 weeks away from living out of my car and going to homeless shelters for food. But I'll tell you fuckers this, despite being on the brink of financial destitution and making a video that will ruin all of my good future career prospects, and probably having some people that would like to kill me for making this video, if it's seen by anyone at all. I'm happier than I've ever been in my entire life. And that I really mean. The realist advice of this video, unfortunately, because I do not want to take this advice, is if you relate to this video at all and think you're on the moral insanity spectrum, you should not be doing drugs. Brian knows he can't control himself, even with just a little bit of alcohol or pot. He can't. And if you're on my end of the spectrum, that's a little bit of a problem, but more so you risk triggering a psychotic disorder. Let's do whatever the fuck we want, but not get institutionalized. Long live moral insanity.